Welcome back to 5-Minute History. Today, you are about to be taken on a journey through the dark history of World War I, a conflict that forever changed the course of human history. It's a story of unprecedented violence and suffering, of technological innovation and industrialized warfare, and of the sacrifice of millions of men and women. World War I began in 1914, triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. But the roots of the conflict were deeper and more complex than a single event. The great powers of Europe had been building up their military and industrial strength for decades, in a feverish arms race that created a sense of paranoia and mistrust among the nations. The complex web of alliances that had been forged in the years leading up to the war meant that a small regional conflict quickly escalated into a global war that engulfed much of Europe and beyond. The scale of the war was unprecedented. Millions of soldiers were mobilized, and the fighting raged across multiple fronts, from the trenches of France to the deserts of the Middle East. The technology of warfare had also advanced, with machine guns, tanks, and poison gas all playing a deadly role in the conflict. One of the lesser-known facts about World War I is the role that animals played in the conflict. Horses, mules, and donkeys were used to transport soldiers, weapons, and supplies, often enduring terrible conditions and brutal treatment. Dogs were trained to carry messages and search for wounded soldiers on the battlefield, while pigeons were used to send messages back to headquarters. The human cost of the war was staggering. Millions of soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded, and entire cities and towns were devastated by bombing and artillery fire. The psychological toll of the war was also immense, with many soldiers suffering from shell shock, a term used to describe the psychological trauma caused by the constant exposure to the horrors of war. One of the most tragic and controversial episodes of World War I was the use of chemical weapons. Both sides used poison gas, causing horrific injuries and deaths. The effects of the gas were particularly brutal, causing blindness, burns, and suffocation. Despite the devastating impact of chemical warfare, it was used again in World War II, and today, the threat of chemical weapons remains a serious concern. The war finally ended in 1918, but the legacy of the conflict was felt for decades to come. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, imposed harsh penalties on Germany, setting the stage for World War II. The war also sparked a wave of social and political upheaval, as the old order of Europe was swept away, and new nations emerged from the ashes of the conflict. The aftermath of World War I was marked by a period of turmoil and instability. The Russian Revolution of 1917 led to the establishment of the Soviet Union, while the collapse of the Ottoman Empire created a power vacuum in the Middle East. The war also paved the way for the rise of fascist regimes in Europe, as disillusionment with the old order and the harsh economic conditions of the post-war period fueled extremism and nationalism. But the war also had a profound impact on society and culture. The experience of the war challenged traditional notions of masculinity and femininity, leading to new forms of expression in art, literature, and music. The war also inspired the birth of new technologies, from aviation to radio, that would transform the world in the years to come. As we remember the sacrifice of the millions who died in the war, it's important to reflect on the lessons that we can learn from this dark chapter in history. We must work tirelessly to prevent conflict and promote peace, and build a world where the horrors of war are a thing of the past. We must remember the cost of war and the impact it can have on individuals, families, and entire societies. The lessons of World War I are more important now than ever before, as we confront new global challenges and seek to build a better world for future generations. We must also remember the human stories that lie behind the statistics and the headlines. The soldiers who went to war, often at a very young age, experienced unimaginable horrors on the battlefield. The families who received news of their loved ones' deaths or injuries and had to carry on with their lives in the face of tremendous grief and loss. We must never forget the sacrifices that were made during World War I, and the lessons that we can learn from this dark period of history. It is our duty to honor the memory of those who fought and died in the war by working towards a more peaceful and just world, where the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights are upheld and protected. In conclusion, the history of World War I is a complex and tragic story that continues to shape our world today. It was a conflict that involved millions of people from all over the world, and its impact was felt far beyond the battlefield. As we remember the sacrifices that were made during this dark period of history, let us also look towards the future with hope and optimism.